I hadn't anticipated the rush of nerves as we pulled up to the rustic log cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was quaint, isolated, and seemed untouched by time, exactly how Ed had described it over countless dinners with my husband, Tom. Every time he reminisced about this cabin, I could see the sparkle in his eye, a flicker of youthful excitement that seemed out of place in his graying, 65-year-old frame. Ed was the quintessential outdoorsman, a man at home with nature, comfortable with quiet isolation. And now, after years of listening to their stories, here I was, finally invited along. Tom had to leave for an emergency at work, much to my disappointment. I nearly canceled, but Ed insisted. "Come on, it'll be good for you to unwind. You deserve a break too," he had said, his voice warm, almost coaxing through the phone. Tom trusted him, and honestly so did I. But the idea of spending a weekend alone with him in his secluded cabin stirred an inexplicable thrill within me. As we stepped inside, I took in the warmth of the place. Rustic wooden beams, a well-worn leather couch, and a stone fireplace that seemed to crackle with life even in its stillness. Ed moved around with a familiarity and ease that made me feel safe yet strangely out of place, like I was trespassing on something private. He poured 2 glasses of wine, offering me one with a smile that was both fatherly and something else, something that made me avert my eyes and quickly glance away. "Make yourself at home," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "I'll start a fire, and you can put your things in a room down the hall." I nodded, feeling my cheeks warm as I turned away. As I unpacked, the cozy silence of the cabin settled around me, heightening my awareness of every sound, every movement. When I returned, the fire was already blazing, casting a soft glow over the room. Ed sat in one of the armchairs, the light accentuating the lines of his face, giving him a rugged charm that I hadn't noticed before. I joined him on the couch, trying to relax, but an unnameable tension filled the air between us. We talked for hours, laughter flowing easily between sips of wine and shared stories. The night wore on, and the initial awkwardness melted away, replaced by an unexpected intimacy. I found myself leaning closer, hanging on to his every word, captivated by the intensity in his gaze. He looked at me in a way that was gentle but piercing, a look that seemed to see beyond the surface, past the roles we played in each other's lives. At one point, I realized his hand was resting just inches from mine on the couch, and a strange thrill raced through me. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a subtle heat that seemed to draw me in. I tried to dismiss it, but the sensation lingered, wrapping around my thoughts like a fog I couldn't shake. I glanced up, catching his eyes for just a moment too long, and felt a blush rise to my cheeks. Ed cleared his throat, leaning back in his chair, his gaze never wavering. "It's good to have company out here. Sometimes I forget what it's like to just talk. To share a space with someone." His words hung in the air, unspoken meanings woven into each syllable. I shifted, the pulse of tension between us growing more pronounced, an unacknowledged understanding passing between us. The night wore on, and as the fire crackled, our conversation softened into silences that felt less empty and more charged, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. My eyes drifted to the window, where a mist had settled over the forest, shrouding the view in an ethereal gray. It gave the room an added sense of seclusion, as if we were the only 2 people left in the world. I could feel Ed's gaze on me, even as I pretended to be engrossed in the dancing flames. My heart raced, each beat echoing louder in my chest as I tried to keep my composure. I glanced over, and the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, like he knew what I was feeling, like he felt it, too. A subtle yet unmistakable connection, one that was both thrilling and terrifying. He shifted in his chair, leaning forward, his hand resting on the edge of the coffee table. "Are you comfortable? I know it can be a bit quiet out here for some," he said, his voice warm and laced with concern. "Actually, it's really nice." "Peaceful," I replied, surprised at the softness in my own voice, as if the quietness of the cabin had softened my edges too. Our eyes met again, and this time, I didn't look away. There was a depth in his gaze, a gravity that pulled me in, urging me to bridge the gap that felt like a chasm and yet only inches wide. The tension was nearly tangible, humming between us, tightening with each passing second. I could almost hear the unspoken thoughts between us, like a drumbeat growing louder and louder, the air charged with anticipation. "I'm glad you came," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile tension that held us together in that moment. "Me too," I murmured, the words leaving my lips before I could second-guess them. I didn't know what I meant by it or why it felt so heavy. The next thing I knew, his hand had moved just a little closer, the warmth of his fingers almost brushing mine. A surge of panic mixed with exhilaration rose within me, and I couldn't decide whether to pull back or lean in. I stayed frozen, my breath catching in my throat as his hand finally met mine, his fingers grazing over my knuckles in a feather-light touch that sent a shiver up my spine. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur, filled with something that bordered on reverence, as if he were asking for permission to enter some sacred place. I nodded, swallowing hard, my heart pounding so loudly I feared he might hear it. His touch was so gentle, yet there was an intensity beneath it, a quiet strength that made me feel both vulnerable and alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He entwined his fingers with mine, his grip firm yet tender, as if he were holding something precious. We sat like that, hands clasped, neither of us daring to move or speak, the silence filled only with the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of our breathing. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. Finally, he released my hand and stood up, gesturing towards the kitchen. "Let me get us another drink," he said, his voice low and steady, though I could see the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for the wine bottle. As he poured, I caught glimpses of his reflection in the window, his face lined with an expression I couldn't quite place, a mixture of yearning, restraint, and something deeper, something raw and vulnerable that he usually kept hidden. I felt a surge of warmth at the sight, a sudden and powerful tenderness that made me want to reach out, to cross the distance between us. When he returned with the glasses, I took a slow sip, trying to calm the storm of emotions churning within me. He sat back down, closer this time, his knee just inches from mine. The warmth from the fire mingled with the heat radiating from him, enveloping us in a cocoon of intimacy that felt almost forbidden. "I don't know what it is about you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if he were confessing a secret. "There's something different." I met his gaze, my breath hitching, as I saw the unfiltered honesty in his eyes. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I reached out, my hand finding his, giving a slight squeeze that spoke louder than words. His hand tightened around mine, his thumb grazing over my palm in a way that sent a thrill through me, an electric current that seemed to pulse in time with the beating of my heart. Our eyes held, the tension reaching a breaking point, an unspoken promise hanging in the air between us. As if drawn by an invisible force, he leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. I could feel his hesitation, the way he held back, as if giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned in, closing the distance, our lips brushing in a kiss that was soft yet filled with an intensity that left me breathless. Time seemed to slow, the world fading into a blur as we gave in to the pull that had been simmering between us. The kiss deepened, his hand slipping into my hair, pulling me closer as if he couldn't bear to let go. Each touch, each brush of his lips against mine, sent a rush of warmth through me, a sweetness mingling with the thrill of crossing a line we could never uncross. Our embrace grew bolder, each movement more deliberate, every touch more electric. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin in a way that felt both tender and possessive. I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, as his lips moved with an intensity that matched the rush of my own heartbeat. It was as if we had crossed into a world beyond time, a place where the consequences of tomorrow didn't exist. But then, he pulled back slightly, his face inches from mine, his gaze searching, hesitant. His hand rested on my shoulder, his touch grounding me as we both caught our breath. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between desire and restraint, and it mirrored my own inner turmoil. Part of me wanted to let go, to throw caution to the wind and give in to the need that pulsed between us. But the other part, a quieter, steadier voice, held me back, reminding me of the life waiting for me outside this secluded cabin, of the promises and commitments that couldn't be erased. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, yet he didn't move away. His fingers traced along my arm, leaving a trail of warmth in their wake, and his gaze held mine, vulnerable and raw. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't be." And with those words, I felt the final remnants of hesitation melt away. We shared a moment of silent understanding, a wordless acknowledgement of the risk, the thrill, the sheer inevitability of what was happening between us. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer once more, and our lips met again in a kiss that was deeper, more urgent, carrying a weight of unspoken desire and unacknowledged longing. His fingers tangled in my hair, his other hand moving to the small of my back, pressing me against him in a way that left no space between us. I could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, echoing against mine, and the sensation was grounding, yet exhilarating. Every touch, every gentle caress, seemed to dissolve the distance between us, the barriers that had kept us apart, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection we shared. It was as though every unspoken feeling, every hidden desire, was spilling out, finally given room to breathe. As we pulled back, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his expression softened with an emotion I couldn't quite place, a mixture of relief and longing, of joy and sadness. I never expected," he trailed off, his voice thick with the weight of everything he left unsaid. Neither of us spoke for a moment, the silence between us filled with the soft crackle of the fire, the sound of our breathing, the unspoken emotions that lingered in the air. I felt his hand slowly slide down to entwine with mine, his fingers fitting perfectly, like they were meant to be there. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been alone for so long, and now you're here." The vulnerability in his words struck me, pulling at something deep within me. I squeezed his hand, my heart heavy with a mixture of empathy and yearning, an ache that had no words but lingered nonetheless. I had come here expecting a quiet weekend, nothing more, but now I realized this trip had awakened something within me, something I hadn't even known was missing. The evening wore on, our connection deepening with each passing moment, each soft word and gentle touch. We spoke in whispers, our voices blending with the sounds of the forest outside, and as the fire burned low, we finally drifted into silence, wrapped in each other's warmth, in the comfort of a closeness that felt both new and inevitable. In the early morning hours, as the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin window, I awoke to find him watching me, a soft smile on his face, his gaze filled with a warmth that made my chest tighten. There was something unspoken between us, an understanding that the events of the night had changed us, bound us together in a way that could never be undone. As the day began, the weight of reality settled in, a bittersweet reminder of the lives we'd soon return to, of the boundaries we'd crossed and the consequences we'd eventually face. But for now, in this quiet cabin hidden from the world, we allowed ourselves this fleeting moment of solace, a memory that would linger long after the last embers of the fire had faded to ash.